In the heart of America's Midwest, a sprawling sea of cornfields stretched across the horizon. For decades, the landscape had been synonymous with agricultural abundance, where the American dream of farming was alive and thriving. Farmers in Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois woke every day to the promise of the harvest, knowing their crops would feed the world. Corn, soybeans, and wheat were the backbone of the global food chain, and the United States was the kingpin. But in the summer of 2025, something strange began to happen. The usual hum of grain elevators and trucks hauling bushels of corn started to fall silent. At first, it was just a few missed orders here and there. A shipment from Nebraska that should have been headed to China was delayed indefinitely. Another one to South Korea had been quietly canceled. Soon more and more contracts were slipping through the cracks like sand falling through an open hand. At the heart of it all was corn. American corn, once considered the gold standard of the world's food supply. As global demand grew, the U.S. had always been the top exporter. But now dock workers in Shanghai and Rotterdam were staring at stacks of shipping containers filled with pristine golden corn that no one seemed to want. No one was rejecting the corn because it was spoiled. No, it was as clean and high quality as ever. It was simply the label on the bags that had turned it into an invisible burden. Product of the United States. A stamp that had once symbolized excellence in agriculture was now a curse. The world's appetite for American corn was slipping away, not because the product was bad, but because the political climate had shifted. Geopolitical tension, trade wars, and an unpredictable policy landscape had made countries wary of American products. No formal bans or headlines, just a slow, suffocating silence as buyers turned their backs on U.S. shipments without a word. Nebraska's corn exports had dropped nearly 50% in just a year. China, Mexico, Egypt, countries that had been longtime partners began to quietly shift their contracts elsewhere. The solution wasn't easy for American farmers. They had done everything right, planted the highest quality corn, processed it with care, and shipped it on time. But the market was telling them something else. They were still producing, but no one was buying. Back at the docks, workers moved around the massive containers like ghosts doing their jobs without looking at the boxes. It wasn't that the corn was bad, it was just American. And in today's volatile trade environment, that was enough to keep it sitting untouched. For those working the docks, the silence was deafening. In a small town in Iowa, a third-generation farmer named James watched the piles of unsold corn in his silo grow higher and higher. His phone had stopped ringing with new orders. Foreign buyers had stopped showing up, and with each passing week, more corn had sat unsold and unclaimed. He wasn't angry, just defeated. His family had worked this land for years, but now it seemed like the world was moving on without them. His neighbors, too, faced the same fate. The ethanol plant down the road had just laid off half its workforce. The grain co-op had stopped accepting deliveries. The once bustling heart of the local agricultural economy had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie stillness. James took a deep breath as he walked through his fields, the golden crops standing tall and proud under the sun. The land hadn't changed. The crops hadn't changed. What had changed was the world's perception of what it meant to be American. And that was where the problem lay: image, trust, and politics. It wasn't the corn that had changed, it was the perception of it. Countries that once depended on American corn for their food supply were looking elsewhere, not because the corn wasn't good enough, but because of the political baggage attached to it. That's when a new player started to emerge on the global stage: Brazil. With their vast, fertile lands and a crop-growing season that seemed to go on forever, Brazil began to fill the gap left by the American shift. The world noticed. And as Brazil's corn exports grew, countries like Egypt, South Korea, and even China started to quietly replace their American shipments with Brazilian ones. Brazil's timing couldn't have been more perfect. The world was looking for something reliable, and Brazil was delivering it without the political baggage that came with American exports. For the American farmers, the shift was not just economic, it was personal. They had been the breadbasket of the world, but now they were facing the reality that they were no longer wanted. The trucks that once roared down the highways carrying corn to ports were now silent. The fields that once represented prosperity were now just a reminder of the world's indifference. The United States had lost its crown as the world's top corn producer, not because of a better product, but because of a better story. Brazil's rise was quite efficient and steady, and as the world turned its attention, the South American farmers were left wondering what had gone wrong. As Brazil's corn industry surged, American farmers in the heartland watched helplessly as their exports dwindled. The shift wasn't just about pricing or quality, it was about trust. Brazil, with its stable policies, predictable trade routes, and booming agricultural sector, had found a way to become the world's go-to supplier. Meanwhile, the United States, once the undisputed leader in the global agricultural market, found itself sidelined, a casualty of its own domestic political volatility. Farmers in Nebraska and Iowa were no strangers to tough times, but this was different. This wasn't a slump caused by drought or poor harvests. This was a shift in the global market that was happening quietly behind closed doors. Brazilian corn, cheap, reliable, and politically neutral, had become the preferred choice for importers looking for stability. And in today's fast-paced global trade system, stability was everything. The effects were felt throughout rural America. Corn silos that once stood at full capacity were now barely half full. The familiar hum of grain elevators had been replaced with an eerie silence. In warehouses across the Midwest, corn sat untouched, waiting for buyers that never came. For the first time in decades, farmers couldn't sell their crops. And it wasn't because the corn wasn't good enough, it was the label on the bag that was causing all the problems. Brazil wasn't just offering corn, it was offering a system. Brazil's government had invested heavily in modernizing its agricultural infrastructure, making it easier for buyers to track shipments and ensure the quality of the products. Every step of the process was digitized, from planting to harvesting to shipping. Brazil's farmers had embraced technology, and the global market took notice. In contrast, the U.S. was still relying on a fragmented system with inconsistent records, outdated logistics, and unpredictable political climate. The world didn't just want corn, they wanted certainty. While the American farmers watched their exports decline, Brazil's agricultural sector was booming. The country's corn exports surged by 15% in 2025 alone, and new deals were being made with countries that had long relied on the U.S. As Brazil's corn reached new markets in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, American farmers were left wondering what happened to their place at the table. In Nebraska, one of the biggest corn-growing states, families were struggling to keep their farms afloat. Farmers who had built their entire livelihoods on the promise of international corn contracts were now facing the reality of lost sales, unsold crops, and dwindling profits. Some farmers were forced to let go of staff. Others were facing bankruptcy, and the worst part, no one seemed to have an answer for them. The situation was especially dire in Iowa, the heart of American corn production. The state's corn exports had fallen by nearly 40% since 2023. In the small town of Des Moines, a third-generation farmer named Sam watched as his harvest, once destined for international markets, sat idly in silos. He used to be able to sell his corn with a simple handshake, knowing that his contracts were secured with the world's biggest importers. Now those same buyers had shifted their loyalties to Brazil, and Sam was left to wonder how he could keep his farm running. He wasn't the only one. Farmers across Iowa were faced with the same harsh reality: their crops had nowhere to go. And as the summer months turned into fall, the backlog of unsold corn grew larger. The familiar rhythm of planting, harvesting, and shipping had ground to a halt. Instead of selling their corn, farmers were lining up at co-ops to ask for storage extensions. Some were even paying to store last year's crop, unable to sell it at a reasonable price. The market had spoken, but no one was listening. What made the situation even worse was the complete silence from Washington. The government, busy with its own political battles, had offered no solutions. There were no new trade deals, no support for the farmers who had been the backbone of the country's agricultural system for generations. The administration's policies, which had once been centered around making the U.S. the global leader in agriculture, had become too erratic to support long-term growth. Farmers, once proud to be the face of American agriculture, now felt abandoned. And then there was the growing threat from Canada, which had quietly positioned itself as a stronger alternative to U.S. corn. With its stable government and transparent export systems, Canada was now the preferred choice for many international buyers. The Canadian agricultural sector had adapted to the demands of the global market, ensuring that buyers could track shipments with ease and trust that the product would arrive on time. In short, Canada had built a system that the U.S. had failed to. Canada's success didn't just come from its product, it came from its system. The Canadian government had invested in new technology to ensure that every step of the supply chain was traceable. In contrast, the U.S. system was still struggling with outdated logistics and inconsistent documentation. Buyers wanted security, and Canada was offering it in spades. For the farmers who had been left behind, it wasn't just about corn, it was about trust. The American market had once been a symbol of reliability, but now it felt like a gamble. Buyers didn't want to deal with the uncertainty of tariffs, trade wars, and political instability. They wanted a partner they could count on, and in 2025, that partner was no longer the United States. In a quiet town in Nebraska, Sam walked past his silo filled with unsold corn. The fields stretched out before him golden and waiting to be harvested. But no one was coming to collect it. The phone had stopped ringing. The contracts had dried up, and he was left wondering how much longer he could hold on before his family farm built over decades of hard work slipped through his fingers. Across the world, Brazil's rise was reshaping the global agricultural landscape. It wasn't just a new competitor, it was a new way of doing business. A quiet, efficient competitor that knew how to give the world what it wanted: consistency, transparency, and reliability. And as Brazil's market share grew, the U.S. was left scrambling to figure out what went wrong. The shifting tides in global agriculture had started a new battle, but it wasn't one fought with weapons. It was a quiet, invisible war, a battle for trust systems and reliability. While the U.S. watched its once unassailable position as the world's largest corn exporter crumble, Brazil was rising steadily, filling the vacuum left behind. In Iowa, the loss was palpable. The region's fields, which had once been ripe with promise, now stood as a testament to a broken system. Sam, like many farmers, couldn't fathom what had happened. The contracts that once promised steady income now seemed like relics of the past, replaced by uncertainty and a growing sense of abandonment. What had once been a proud part of the American dream now felt like a distant memory. There was a time when Brazil's agricultural sector had been the underdog, often overshadowed by the industrial might of the U.S., but the past decade had changed everything. Brazil had invested heavily in modernizing its agricultural practices. From advanced irrigation systems to blockchain-based traceability, for every shipment, Brazil had embraced technology in a way that the U.S. had failed to. And it wasn't just the infrastructure. The country had adopted a long-term stable approach to trade, avoiding the political chaos and trade wars that had plagued U.S. agriculture in recent years. For Brazil's farmers, it wasn't about competing on quality alone. The real value lay in consistency. The global market, more than ever, was looking for a reliable partner. Brazil, with its solid infrastructure and transparent trade systems, offered what U.S. exporters no longer could: stability. Brazilian corn wasn't just good, it was predictable. It was safe, and most importantly, it came without the risk of sudden tariffs, fluctuating regulations, or the uncertainty of political retaliation. In stark contrast, U.S. farmers, especially those in Iowa, were faced with the fallout of a system that couldn't keep up. For years, farmers in Iowa had relied on a network that they thought would always be their: co-ops, trade deals, and government support. But the U.S. had begun to fracture. Political instability, tariff wars, and fluctuating trade policies had created a perfect storm, one in which predictability was no longer guaranteed. Sam's heart sank every time he saw the empty docks or heard about the cancellation of his export contracts. It wasn't just a financial hit, it was a blow to his identity. This wasn't just business to him, it was family legacy and pride. And yet the world had moved on. His phone sat silent, and the cold, empty grain bins were a reminder of the harsh new reality: the silent replacement. While U.S. farmers dealt with their mounting losses, Canada seized the opportunity with quiet efficiency. Canada had been watching the slow collapse of American exports, and unlike the U.S., it had been preparing for this moment. Canada had long since invested in technology that would give it a competitive edge: digital tracking systems, automated inspection systems, and a transparent trade process that allowed buyers to trace every step of their purchase. Canada's approach wasn't flashy. It wasn't about political grandstanding or drawing attention to itself. Canada had simply built a better system, one that allowed international buyers to trust in their shipments. The Canadian agricultural sector had become streamlined and reliable, and that's exactly what the world needed. Unlike the U.S., which had been bogged down by political drama and trade conflicts, Canada was steady. In contrast to the U.S. farm crisis, Canada's export systems were flourishing. Their grain terminals had become hubs of activity. Buyers flocked to Canada's ports eager for the certainty that Canadian grain offered. In 2025, Canadian corn exports grew by 20%, and new deals were signed with Asia, Europe, and even the Middle East. As American farmers struggled to sell their crops, Canadian farmers were securing long-term contracts with minimal effort. The shift in global trade had begun to feel like an invisible force slowly reshaping the world's grain supply chain. Brazilian corn was taking market share from the U.S., and now Canada was stepping in to replace U.S. exports in key regions like Mexico, Japan, and South Korea. It wasn't a sudden takeover, it was a quiet, steady replacement. Countries didn't have to publicly announce that they were no longer relying on U.S. exports. They simply stopped buying, quietly shifting their purchases to Canada and Brazil. For farmers like Sam in Iowa, the cold silence of unsold corn had turned into an unbearable weight. The once booming grain industry had become a shadow of itself, and the familiar rhythms of harvests and shipments had fallen into a dissonant lull. The last few years had been a wake-up call, but even now, with their backs against the wall, the farmers couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. The unseen shift. In the weeks that followed, the full impact of the shift became clear. U.S. farmers who had once been proud suppliers of the world's corn were now facing a long-term struggle. Despite their best efforts, the industry was no longer competitive. Even with cheaper prices, U.S. corn could no longer match the efficiency, transparency, and political stability offered by Brazil and Canada. The global market had simply moved on. In the Midwest, the mood was grim. Farmers had no choice but to make difficult decisions. Some were forced to sell their land, others were bowing out of the industry altogether. Even those who had stuck it out couldn't help but feel the slow burn of failure. Their once proud legacy, built over generations, was crumbling right before their eyes. And there was no one to blame but the system they had trusted for so long. And in the background, the U.S. government, caught up in its own political turmoil, did little to address the issue. The trade policies that had once been a symbol of American agricultural dominance were now contributing to the downfall of the very industry they were supposed to protect. But one thing became clear: the global market was not going to wait for the U.S. to catch up. Countries that had once relied on American exports had already found their new suppliers. Brazil and Canada had seized the opportunity, and they weren't looking back. The aftermath. As 2025 drew to a close, the damage to the U.S. agricultural sector was undeniable. Exports were down, storage bins were overflowing, and the livelihoods of thousands of farmers hung in the balance. The industry that had once been the backbone of American agriculture was now a fraction of what it had been. The loss of global trust, compounded by political instability, had caused a massive shift in the global grain market. For the farmers who remained, there was one question on their minds: how could they survive in a world where the game had changed and they were no longer the frontrunners? The rise of Brazil and Canada had changed the rules, and now the U.S. was playing catch-up in a race it had once led. The quiet disappearance of American corn from global markets was more than just a setback. It was the end of an era. And for the farmers of the U.S., it was a painful reminder that in global trade, reputation was everything, and the U.S. had lost its shine. As the calendar flipped to 2026, the consequences of the quiet shift in global trade became undeniable. What had once been the proud legacy of American agriculture, corn, soybeans, and wheat, was now a memory of the past, slowly fading into the backdrop of a world where Brazil and Canada had claimed the stage. For the U.S. to even begin to understand what had happened, it had to first recognize that the world's expectations had changed. The global market, once dominated by American exports, had adapted quickly. In Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, buyers had grown accustomed to the steady and predictable supply of Brazilian and Canadian grains. But the true game changer wasn't just the competitive pricing or the abundant supply, it was the complete overhaul in the way these countries conducted business. While U.S. exporters grappled with outdated infrastructure and fractured supply chains, Brazil and Canada had embraced technology in ways the U.S. hadn't. Brazil's rise had been fueled by a combination of modern farming techniques, investment in logistics, and a steady push to ensure their agricultural exports were politically neutral and free from the unpredictability that had become a hallmark of U.S. trade policies. Canadian grain, too, was gaining favor, especially with buyers looking for traceability, transparency, and consistency. By 2026, the global demand for corn, soybeans, and wheat had not dwindled. It had simply changed its course. And as the buyers shifted, so did the suppliers. Brazil's corn harvest, now a reliable force in global markets, had expanded its reach beyond just Europe and the Middle East. The country's ability to deliver on time without political baggage had placed it at the top of the list for importers. Meanwhile, Canada had capitalized on its clean, efficient, and transparent systems, quickly becoming the new darling of Asia's largest grain importers. For American farmers, this reality was a bitter pill to swallow. The promise of a prosperous future that had once been tied to vast expanses of cornfields now seemed out of reach. In towns like Cedar Rapids and Des Moines, farmers who had once prided themselves on producing the world's best corn watched helplessly as their shipments sat idle at the docks. But it wasn't just the corn sitting stagnant, it was the entire agricultural system of the Midwest, which had been built around the flow of American exports to global markets. The loss of U.S. dominance in grain exports was a systemic failure, a breakdown not just in infrastructure, but in a larger, more important aspect, the loss of trust. Buyers no longer saw American exports as a safe bet. They saw unpredictability, uncertainty, and political risk. Brazil's and Canada's steady rise had exposed the fragility of the U.S.'s agricultural system, and no one felt it more than the farmers who had watched contracts vanish in the night. The rise of the new export giants. In Brazil, the changes had been even more dramatic. What had once been a relatively unknown competitor in the global agricultural market was now a serious challenger to the U.S.'s position. The country's leadership had embraced an aggressive push to modernize every aspect of its agricultural exports, from planting to harvesting, from packaging to shipping. Brazil had streamlined it all, but the true genius of Brazil's strategy lay in its ability to build a system that was completely transparent. Every step of the production process could be traced from the seed planted in the soil to the container loaded onto a ship bound for Asia. This transparency wasn't just a marketing strategy, it was a way of ensuring that buyers felt secure in their contracts. Canada, too, had invested heavily in infrastructure and technology. Its ports were efficient, its logistics impeccable. But what set Canada apart wasn't just its ability to deliver quality grain, it was its ability to avoid the pitfalls of political drama. As the U.S. became embroiled in trade wars, tariffs, and shifting policies, Canada became the reliable alternative. For importers seeking stability and consistency, Canada offered just that. Unlike the U.S., which had been a slave to unpredictable policies, Canada's agricultural system had become synonymous with trust. For American farmers, it was a devastating realization. Brazil and Canada weren't just competing for market share, they were rewriting the rules of global trade. As the U.S. continued to struggle with its broken trade systems and fractured relationships, these countries had embraced new technologies and systems that made them far more competitive. While U.S. farmers fought to sell their crops, Brazil and Canada had already moved ahead, locking in long-term contracts and securing their place as the new leaders of the global grain market. The unseen future. In rural America, the situation continued to worsen. As co-ops failed to sell the bumper crops that had once been their bread and butter, farmers began looking for new ways to survive. Some attempted to adapt, investing in new technologies and trying to find new markets for their crops. Others, however, simply gave up. Many farmers who had once been proud to carry the mantle of American agriculture began questioning their place in a world that had moved on without them. Sam, once the proud owner of a thriving corn farm, now found himself staring at empty fields and even emptier promises. The quiet replacement of U.S. corn by Brazilian and Canadian exports was more than just a loss, it was an existential crisis. For decades, farmers like him had been the backbone of American agriculture. But now they were standing on the sidelines as the world passed them by. And yet, even in the midst of this collapse, there was hope, small, fleeting, but still present. Some farmers refused to let go of the legacy they had inherited. They tried to innovate to find new ways to appeal to the global market. Some even turned to sustainable farming practices, hoping that the world's demand for organic and ethically grown food might offer them a lifeline. But the competition from Brazil and Canada was fierce, and with every passing day, the challenge grew larger. The New World Order. By the time 2026 was coming to a close, the world's agricultural markets had undergone a dramatic transformation. Brazil and Canada had emerged as the dominant forces in global grain exports. The U.S., once the undisputed leader in this field, now found itself fighting for scraps. Its farmers, once the world's most reliable suppliers, were now struggling to make ends meet as their crops sat unsold in warehouses. For the U.S., the future of its agricultural sector was unclear. The political turmoil, trade wars, and unpredictability that had caused so many problems for American farmers weren't going away. The global market had shifted. The U.S. could either adapt and rebuild its reputation, or it could watch as its once thriving agricultural sector slipped into obscurity. For Brazil and Canada, the future was bright. With stable political climates, modern agricultural systems, and an unwavering commitment to transparency, these two countries had secured their place as the new giants of global agriculture. The world had changed, and the U.S. had to face the uncomfortable truth the world had moved on, and it wasn't looking back. As the world's agricultural markets continued to shift in 2027, the U.S. found itself struggling to keep up. The silent collapse of the once dominant corn industry was not just a logistical problem, it was a deep-rooted psychological wound. Farmers, many of whom had inherited their land from generations past, were left questioning the future of their farms and the agricultural system they had worked tirelessly to build. In Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, the decline was evident. Farmhouses once brimming with activity during harvest season now stood quiet. The sound of combine harvesters no longer filled the air. Instead, there was only the echo of lost opportunities. It wasn't just the unsold corn, it was the empty promises that had once been delivered with each passing trade deal. Local grain elevators, once bustling with trucks unloading freshly harvested crops, now stood abandoned. The windows were dusty, and the signs advertising grain prices were half-rusted. Co-ops that had long been the lifeblood of rural America were now scrambling to stay afloat, burdened with unsold stock and the looming threat of bankruptcy. Farmers walked into these empty facilities hoping for news of a buyer, only to be met with silence. The United States had long been the bedrock of global agriculture, and for decades, corn exports from Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois had kept the global food supply chain running. But that foundation was beginning to crack. The quiet replacement of American corn with Brazilian and Canadian grain had sent shockwaves through the American farming community, and it wasn't just the farmers who felt it. Agricultural suppliers, from equipment manufacturers to seed producers, were now facing a grim reality. With fewer orders coming in from the U.S. grain industry, companies that had relied on the steady flow of business from American farmers were forced to downsize, lay off workers, or close their doors entirely. In rural towns across the Midwest, the emotional toll of the collapse was evident. Small businesses that once thrived on the economic boom created by agricultural exports, restaurants, gas stations, hardware stores, now saw fewer customers. The knock-on effects were visible everywhere. As fewer crops were harvested and sold, the local economy shrank. People began leaving the small towns, seeking work elsewhere, further draining the lifeblood from these already struggling communities. The fight for stability. But not all was lost. In the face of adversity, some farmers were determined to keep fighting. A small group of innovators and visionaries began pushing back against the current, determined to revitalize American agriculture and reclaim their place in the global market. These farmers were embracing sustainable practices, organic farming, and newer technologies that could help restore the reputation of U.S. corn. One such farmer, David Taylor from Nebraska, had watched his once thriving operations shrink over the past few years. His cornfields, once vast and abundant, were now empty spaces that seemed to mirror the despair he felt in his heart. But David wasn't ready to give up just yet. He invested in precision agriculture tools that would help him monitor his crops more efficiently. He partnered with local businesses to create a cooperative that would help farmers pool resources and share knowledge. David also started experimenting with organic methods, hoping that the demand for sustainably grown corn might offer him a path to regain his competitive edge. He joined forces with other farmers in his region, forming alliances to find new markets and restore American agriculture's reputation. While it wasn't a perfect solution, David was determined to prove that the American farming community still had the drive, the ingenuity, and the resilience to adapt to the changing landscape. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political fallout from the global shift in agricultural exports was beginning to gain traction. Lawmakers, farmers, and trade experts convened to discuss the challenges facing American agriculture. There were discussions of new trade deals, renegotiating tariffs, and exploring ways to make American corn competitive again on the world stage. But the question remained, could the U.S. return to its former dominance? The answer was not simple. The global market had changed. Brazil and Canada were no longer just competitors. They were shaping the future of the industry. Buyers were now looking for more than just a good product. They were seeking stability, transparency, and trust. And while the U.S. had always been a leader in agricultural production, it now faced an uphill battle to regain that trust. The road ahead. As the year progressed, it became clear that the road ahead for American agriculture was uncertain. Farmers like David Taylor, who had dedicated their lives to producing high-quality crops, were doing everything they could to adapt to the changing landscape. They understood that the U.S. had to evolve to embrace new technologies, to rebuild its reputation, and to find new ways to connect with global buyers. But the question remained, was it too late? In the meantime, Brazil and Canada continued to capitalize on the opportunities that had been left behind. Their agricultural systems, modernized and efficient, allowed them to provide the global market with what it wanted: corn, soybeans, and wheat at a lower cost, with fewer risks, and with the political stability that American exporters could no longer offer. For the U.S., the next few years would be critical. It wasn't just about recovering lost market share. It was about reinventing the agricultural sector, building a new reputation, and restoring faith in the American farming system. But that would require a complete overhaul, a commitment to change, and a willingness to face the harsh realities of a global market that had already moved on. The U.S. had once been the dominant force in global agriculture. Now it found itself at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for those who remained committed to American farming, it was a fight worth fighting. They knew that the strength of their land, their innovation, and their resilience would be the key to rebuilding the American agricultural industry. But only time would tell if it would be enough to turn the tide. As the American agricultural industry continued to face its toughest battle in decades, a quiet but powerful transformation was taking place. While the cornfields of the Midwest remained dotted with unsold crops and dwindling contracts, a new generation of farmers began to rise, determined to reshape the future of U.S. agriculture. David Taylor's cooperative, now one of the leading examples of how innovation and community could revive American farming, began to show signs of success. By working closely with universities, agricultural experts, and sustainable technology companies, Taylor's group developed new ways to make their crops more resilient, efficient, and most importantly, more appealing to the global market. They adopted drone technology to monitor crop health, automated irrigation systems to conserve water, and blockchain to provide full transparency to their international buyers. The emphasis on sustainable practices not only aligned with growing consumer demand for ethically sourced products, but it also helped address some of the environmental concerns that had plagued American agriculture for years. With soil health declining in many parts of the U.S., regenerative farming practices were becoming more widespread, focusing on rebuilding soil through crop rotations, cover crops, and reduced chemical inputs. One particularly successful initiative was the partnership between David's Co-op and a large food retailer based in Europe, which had previously purchased most of its corn from Brazil. The retailer, recognizing the shift in consumer preferences towards more sustainably sourced products, agreed to a pilot project to import organic, traceable U.S. corn. By using blockchain technology, David's Co-op was able to prove every step of the corn's journey from seed to store, providing the transparency and accountability that international buyers demanded. The success of this project, which was soon dubbed the Corn Revolution, sparked interest across the globe. Other countries began looking to American farmers for their high-quality traceable products, but this time the U.S. wasn't just offering grain, it was offering a story of resilience, sustainability, and a commitment to the future. The question was no longer whether American corn was good enough, it was whether the U.S. could deliver on its promise of consistency, quality, and transparency in a rapidly changing market. Meanwhile, across the border, Canada continued to cement its position as a top contender in the global grain market. But rather than becoming complacent, Canadian exporters began to face increasing competition from new players. Russia, with its vast agricultural resources and lower-cost production, began flooding markets in Europe and Asia with cheaper grains. While the U.S. had its problems, the global agricultural trade was becoming a complex battlefield, with every country seeking an edge. In the midst of this competition, Nebraska's corn industry began to slowly recover. The local co-ops, once filled with disappointment, now buzzed with renewed energy as more and more contracts were secured, not just with new international buyers, but also with the expanding domestic market for sustainable products. The price of corn had risen slightly as demand for the high-quality traceable product increased, allowing many farmers to breathe a little easier. The huge stockpiles that once filled the warehouses now had places to go. The success wasn't immediate, but over the course of the next year, American farmers began to realize that it wasn't just about growing the best corn, it was about telling the story of the corn. They had to prove to the world that they could adapt, that they could rise above the political chaos, and that they could deliver on their promises. And slowly they were starting to do just that. As 28 began, a new wave of optimism began to sweep across the Midwest. The world had noticed the changes taking place in U.S. agriculture, and while some still questioned whether it would be enough to reclaim the country's former dominance, there was a growing sense of hope. Farmers who had spent years struggling against tariffs, trade wars, and political instability were now working together to build something new. They had learned from their past mistakes and were no longer depending on a broken system. But the story of recovery wasn't just about U.S. farmers. It was about global trade, a system that was evolving and shifting with new players like Brazil and Canada gaining ground. While the U.S. wasn't out of the race, the competition had become fiercer and the stakes higher. For the first time in decades, U.S. farmers were realizing that they would have to play by a new set of rules if they wanted to stay competitive. The future of American agriculture, once secured by its vast lands and resources, now rested on its ability to adapt, innovate, and restore trust with buyers around the world. David Taylor and his fellow farmers were living proof that despite the odds, it was still possible to fight for a place in the market. The road ahead wasn't easy, but the small victories were adding up. The key to the future of American agriculture lay not just in what they produced, but in how they connected with the world. And for the first time in a long time, there was hope that the American corn industry and its farmers could once again rise to the challenge. The journey of reinvention was just beginning. And while the scars of the past would never fully disappear, the spirit of resilience and hope would guide them through the uncertain road ahead. The optimism that had slowly begun to take root in the heart of American agriculture was fragile. As 2029 dawned, farmers, agricultural companies, and policymakers faced new hurdles, some familiar, others entirely uncharted. But despite the setbacks, there was a growing recognition that the industry was transforming before their eyes. The old way of thinking was fading, replaced by a sense of urgency to reimagine the future. David Taylor, now a key figure in the corn revolution, stood at the edge of a freshly harvested field in Nebraska. The crops were strong, healthy, and growing more resilient every year, but there was still uncertainty in the air. The world had watched the U.S. struggle, but as trade policies continued to shift, new challenges loomed. One of the most pressing issues was the growing dominance of Brazil in the global corn market. Brazil's vast, fertile lands, along with its lower production costs, had enabled it to secure a strong foothold in Asia and the Middle East. This, combined with its efficient logistical systems and transparent export practices, had made it the go-to alternative to American corn for many countries. Brazil had capitalized on the rising demand for cheaper grains, gaining market share that the U.S. had once controlled. But David knew that it wasn't too late. The U.S. could still play a pivotal role if only it could find a way to break free from the cycles of political turmoil and trade wars that had so severely crippled the market. Back in Washington, lawmakers were under pressure to stabilize trade relations and rebuild trust with global buyers. American farmers, especially those in the Corn Belt, had long been the backbone of the nation's agricultural exports, but they were no longer the only game in town. Policy shifts, tariffs, and constant volatility had created an unstable environment for producers. To counter this, a new coalition of agricultural leaders, environmental advocates, and technology innovators began to push for a bold shift in strategy. Rather than focusing solely on competing with Brazil, they turned inward, focusing on ways to make American corn production sustainable, reliable, and innovative. They recognized that while the U.S. still had the infrastructure and the technological capabilities, it had lost something crucial: trust. Buyers, both foreign and domestic, needed stability, and that was something that had been sorely lacking in recent years. The first step in rebuilding that trust was simple but profound: transparency. American farmers had to prove they could meet the exacting standards that global buyers demanded. To that end, blockchain technology was adopted across the industry. Farmers like David Taylor, who had already embraced the need for transparency, began working with tech companies to create traceable supply chains. Every kernel of corn was logged, tracked, and verified from seed to harvest to shipment, allowing buyers to verify the quality and ethical sourcing of the product before it ever left the farm. Meanwhile, the U.S. government began looking for ways to stabilize its trade relations. Several key initiatives were launched, such as renegotiating existing trade deals and establishing new bilateral agreements that prioritize long-term stability over short-term gains. In a landmark move, the U.S. entered a partnership with several Latin American countries to create a regional agricultural trade bloc. This new alliance, dubbed AgriVision, aimed to create a united front for sustainable agricultural practices, reduce reliance on geopolitical tensions, and enhance the competitive position of member countries against larger agricultural powers like Brazil and Russia. But the path to recovery wasn't without setbacks. In the early months of 2029, several key trading partners still wavered, hesitant to make long-term commitments. As much as the U.S. had tried to stabilize its position, many countries were still haunted by the unpredictability that had plagued the past decade. And while the U.S. was beginning to regain some ground, Brazil's aggressive expansion continued to pressure the market. In response, David Taylor's cooperative launched a new initiative called Farm Forward. It was a new way of doing business that focused not just on selling corn, but on creating partnerships that went beyond the transactional. Farm Forward encouraged collaboration between American farmers, their international buyers, and local communities in the markets they served. The initiative promoted sustainable practices, shared knowledge, and local empowerment. It was more than just about corn. It was about making a positive impact on the communities that consumed it. Farm Forward's pilot program began in Japan, where the demand for sustainably grown traceable corn was surging. By working directly with buyers, Japanese farmers, and local cooperatives, the program not only bolstered U.S. corn exports, but also created a unique sense of collaboration between nations that had long been at odds over agricultural policies. The pilot was a success, and the program quickly expanded to other countries, proving that when the focus was on collaboration and mutual benefit, the world was willing to listen. By the end of 2029, there were still challenges. Brazilian corn had a foothold, and Canada had further strengthened its position, offering cleaner and more reliable systems. But American farmers, led by the likes of David Taylor, were no longer on the back foot. They were adapting, evolving, and showing the world that U.S. agriculture could rise above its challenges. The road ahead was long, but the sense of urgency had turned into a driving force. Farmers were no longer waiting for the world to change around them. They were changing it themselves at the Renaissance. The lesson had become clear. It wasn't just about the crop. It was about trust, transparency, and adaptability. And slowly, America's agricultural community was proving it could rebuild its reputation not by returning to the past, but by creating a new future where innovation, sustainability, and global cooperation were the driving forces of success. It wasn't just about corn anymore. It was about taking back control of the global food system. And with that, the U.S. was finding its place in a new world order, one where flexibility and trust were more important than ever.